Lady Lazarus is a complicated, dark, and brutal poem originally published in the collection Ariel. Plath composed the poem during her most productive and fecund creative period. It is considered one of Plath's best poems and has been subject to a plethora of literary criticism since its publication. It is commonly interpreted as an expression of Plath's suicidal attempts and impulses. Its tone veers between menacing and scathing, and it has drawn attention for its use of Holocaust imagery, similar to Daddy. The title is an allusion to the biblical character Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. The standard interpretation of the poem suggests that it is about multiple suicide attempts. The details can certainly be understood in this framework. When the speaker says she has done it again, she means she has attempted suicide for the third time, after one accidental attempt and one deliberate attempt in the past. Each attempt occurred in a different decade, and she is now 30 years old. Now that she has been pulled back to life from this most recent attempt, her sour breath will vanish in a day, and her flesh will return to her bones. However, this discovery is presented as a failure, whereas the suicide attempts are presented as accomplishments. Dying is an art that she performs exceptionally well. She seems to believe she will reach perfection through escaping her body. By describing dying as an art, she includes a spectator to both her deaths and resurrections. Both the death is a performance, it necessarily requires others. In large part, she kills herself to punish them for driving her to it. The eager, peanut crunching crowd is invited but criticized for its voyeuristic impulse. The crowd could certainly be understood to include the reader himself, since he reads a poem to explore her dark impulses. She assumes that her voyeurs are significantly invested. They would pay the large charge to see her scars and her heart. However, she imbues this impulse with a harsh criticism by comparing the crowd to the complacent Germans who stood aside while the Jews were thrown into concentration camps. Further, the crowd ultimately proves less an encouragement than a burden when they also attend the resurrection. She despises the second part of the process and resents the presence of others at that time. Whether this creates a vicious circle in which that resentment is partially responsible for the subsequent attempt is implied not explicitly stated. Critic Robert Bagg explores the speaker's contradictory feelings towards a crowd by writing that Plath is not bound by any metaphysical belief in the self's limitations. Instead of resisting the self's antagonists, she derives a tremendous thrill from throwing her imagination into the act of self obliteration. She can destroy her body, but her imaginative self remains a performer, always aware of the effect she has on others. The poem can be understood through a feminist lens as a demonstration of the female artist's struggle for autonomy in a patriarchal society. Linda K. Bunsen writes that the female creation of a male artist god is asserting independent creative powers. From this perspective, Lady Lazarus is not merely a confessional poem detailing depressive feelings, but is also a statement on how the powerful male figure usurps Plath's creative powers but is defeated by her rebirth. Though Lady Lazarus knows that her doctor will claim possession of her body and remains after forcing her suicide, she equally believes she will rise and eat men like air. Her creative powers can be stifled momentarily, but will always return stronger. The poem can be understood in a larger context as a comment on the relationship between poet and audience in a society that, as Pamela and Anna's claims, has separated creativity and consumption. The crowd views Lady Lazarus, the poet Plath, as an object and therefore does not recognize her as a human being. Plath reflects this through her multiple references to body parts separated from the whole. From this interpretation, Lady Lazarus's suicide then becomes an assertion of wholeness, an act of self definition, and a last desperate act of contempt towards a peanut crunching crowd. The only way she can keep herself intact is to destroy herself, and she does this rather than be turned into commodities. Though her doctor will peruse her remains for commodities, she will not have been defeated because of her final act. As has often been the case in Platt's poems, the Holocaust imagery has drawn much attention from critics and readers. It is quite profuse in this poem. Lady Lazarus addresses a man as her doctor, her enemy, her god, and her Lucifer. She describes her face as a Nazi lampshade and as a Jew linen. As previously described, one effect of these allusions is to implicate the reader, make him or her complicit in passive voyeurism by comparing him or her to the Germans who ignored the Holocaust. However, they also serve to establish a horrific atmosphere than be understood as patriarchy, as a society of consumers, or as simply cruel humans. No matter how one interprets the crowd in the poem, they complicate the poem's meaning so that it is sophisticated exploration of the responsibility we have for each other's unhappiness rather than simply a dire depressive suicide note. Popularity of Lady Lazarus. Lady Lazarus is a bitter dramatic monologue famous for the themes of death and oppression. It was published in 1965, 2 years after her death by suicide. The poem gives hints to multiple suicide attempts of the tormented speaker. It also highlights the role of power and oppression into one's life. The poem also expresses the ideas of not giving up and resurrection. Lady Lazarus as a representative of death. The poem details the tragic life of a lady and her several suicide attempts. She says that she has tried to kill herself many times, but surprisingly survived every time. She asks those who saved her from peeling off the napkin from her face and see her wounded soul. She compares her suffering to Nazi prisoners to make the readers understand the reason for her discontent. As the poem progresses, she provides graphic details of physical and the mentality effects of suicide. She lashes out on her doctors and those who take her as an object of entertainment. She concludes by calling herself a phoenix rising from the ashes. Major themes in Lady Lazarus. Death, depression, pain, and power are the major themes of this poem. The disheartened speaker talks about her failed suicide attempts and gives reasons for her resentment. She also expresses her anger for those who saved her from dying. Despite every effort to die, she still survived. She continuously states the idea that she is being used as an object of entertainment. She regrets that her actions are watched as an act of amusement rather than empathy. Moreover, the people with their fake sympathies are contributing more in her pain and they are not allowing her to be free. Analysis of literary devices used in the poem. Literary devices are tools used by writers to express their emotions, ideas, and themes, and to make the text appealing to the readers. Sylvia Plath has also employed some literary devices in this poem to narrate her failed suicide attempts. The analysis of some of the literary devices used in this poem has been given. She uses simile like, for example, and like the cat, I have nine times to die. Here the poet compares herself with a cat who can survive the tragic fall. Anaphora. It refers to the repetition of a word or expression in the first part of some verse. For example, so is repeated in 22nd stanza of the poem to emphasize the point, or a piece of my hair or my clothes, so her doctor, so her enemy. Enjambment. It is defined as a thought or clause that does not come to an end at a line break. Instead, it moves over to the next line. For example, the second time I meant to last it out and not come back at all. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is a device used to exaggerate any statement for the sake of emphasis. For example, to annihilate each decade is hyperbole, and no one can destroy or erase time. Metaphor. It is a figure of speech in which an implied comparison is made between the objects that are different in nature. For example, a sort of walking miracle, my skin, bright as a Nazi lampshade. Here she compares the suffering to prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps. Assonance. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds in the same lines, such as sound of a in and there is a charge, a very large charge. Imagery. Imagery is used to make readers perceive things involving their five senses. For example, the nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth, to the same place, the same face, the same brute, and or a piece of my hair or my clothes. Analysis of poetic devices used in the poem. Poetic and literary devices are the same, but a few are used only in poetry. Here is the analysis of some of the poetic devices used in Lady Lazarus. Stanza. A stanza is a poetic form of some verses and lines. There are 28 three-line stanzas in this poem. Tercet. A tercet is a three-line stanza borrowed from Hebrew poetry. All the stanzas in the poem are in tercet form. End rhyme. End rhyme is used to make the stanza melodious. For example, here, air, burn, concern, out, shout. Quotes quotes to be used. Here the creature that is out of the ash is a phoenix. This can be used to tell people that everyone can come out as a winner after a difficult time. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair. It can be used to encourage people who are losing hope.